Hello, and welcome to Booked on Shalom World TV. I'm your host, Clare Hinshaw. Today we are speaking with Deacon Greg Kandra, author of Befriending St. Joseph. Deacon Greg serves as a deacon in the Diocese of Brooklyn and worked as a senior writer at the Catholic Near East Welfare Association. He is the author of A Deacon Prays and writes the Deacon's Bench blog. Deacon Greg earned his bachelor's degree in English from the University of Maryland. He then worked as a writer and producer for CBS News from 1982 to 2008 for programs including CBS Evening News with Katie Couric, Sunday Morning, 60 Minutes 2, and 48 Hours, as well as co-writing the acclaimed CBS documentary 9/11. He also served for 4 years as a writer and producer on the live finale of the hit reality show Survivor. Deacon Greg has received numerous awards for his work, including 2 Peabodys, 2 Emmys, 4 Writers Guild of America awards, and a Christopher Award. He was also named 2017 Clergy of the Year by the Catholic Guild of Our Lady of the Skies Chapel at JFK International Airport. His work has been published in American Magazine, U.S. Catholic, Busted Halo, and The Tablet, and he is a regular guest on Catholic radio. Deacon Greg, welcome to Booked.
Thank you very much. It's great to be here, Clara. Thank you.
Well, I'd like to start off, if you could help us set the stage for our viewers. Your book revolves around the 7 sorrows of St. Joseph and this particular devotion. So I'm wondering if you could explain a little bit about that for those who might not be familiar with it.
Sure. It's not very well known, and I wish more people did know about it. The 7 sorrows of St. Joseph roughly parallel the 7 sorrows of Mary, when the sword pierced her heart. And there's 7 moments of his life where he felt great sorrow or sadness. And the way this came about is there were 2 Franciscans in the Middle Ages who were in a shipwreck. And while they were clinging to the wreckage, they prayed to St. Joseph and they asked him to save them. And he appeared to them and he took them to safety. And he asked them to repay him by meditating on the 7 sorrows and subsequent 7 joys of his life. And the 7 sorrows are things that a lot of us know from Scripture, things like wrestling with whether or not to divorce Mary, having to see Jesus born in poverty in Bethlehem, having to flee with his family to Egypt, and then, of course, losing Jesus in Jerusalem and having to search for him and worrying about him. So it's about meditating on those moments and reflecting on them and seeing how Joseph turned those moments, or God was able to turn those moments from moments of great sorrow and great anxiety into moments of joy. And it's a great lesson, I think, for all of us who face challenges in our life. And I think it's something that more people need to pay attention to. And I hope this book helps them to do that.
Absolutely. Well, I love that connection you're making between the sorrows and the joys. It seems to be kind of prefiguring the resurrection, that the sorrow is never the end of the story.
Absolutely. And, a big part of Joseph's life is trust, and trusting that God is going to get him through whatever he wants and going where God leads him. And I think that's another important lesson for all of us.
Definitely. I know I could work on that. Well, something else that I found interesting in the book was the way that you structured the chapters, where you're kind of bouncing back and forth between imagining what St. Joseph might have been thinking in a particular situation, and then sharing your own reflections and based on church teaching about the specific biblical stories. So I'm just curious why you decided to structure the chapters that way.
Well, thinking about Joseph, I realized that he's something of an enigma to a lot of us. He doesn't have any lines in the Bible. There's not a whole lot that we know about his life or where he came from. And I really wanted to humanize him and to help us see him as a person very much like us, someone who had a lot of the same struggles and difficulties that we all had. So I created these little vignettes, moments of his life, almost novelistic in the approach, or little short stories of scenes of his life, and imagined what it must have been like for him, and tried to put myself in his shoes. And hopefully I take the reader there also and put the reader in his shoes or his sandals, and get to see him in a very humanistic, very realistic way, and as someone that we can all relate to.
Well, going off that, I'm really curious how you kind of went about getting into the mind of this saint. What was your technique or strategy for that?
Well, my pastor, Monsignor Joseph Finaro, had a great devotion to St. Joseph, and he used to preach on the feast of St. Joseph, March 19th, that Joseph was not perfect. He was the one member of the Holy Family who wasn't. And he had flaws and he had difficulties and he sinned. And that made me really think of what Joseph is sort of our entree into the Holy Family. And he's the one who is really closest to us and to the way that we are, and who understands our problems and our difficulties the most. And I think someone that we should be able to relate to most closely. So I thought a lot about that and what he had to deal with, and the tremendous trust and sacrifice that he had to make to live the life that God wanted him to live. And so I spent a lot of time thinking about that and imagining what these moments of his life must have been like and how he got through them. I also did a little bit of research. I'm not heavy into research. I didn't do a lot of academic digging to find out more about him. First of all, because there's not a lot that we know. But sort of looked at the history of the time and what it must have been like to be a working class man in a small town in Galilee, and what was that like? And from that, it sort of unfolded very naturally.
Oh, that makes sense. And, I love that expression you just used, that he's kind of the entree for us into the Holy Family. That I've never thought of it that way, but that makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah, he's very relatable, and I hope more people will look at him as a figure of flesh and blood, not just a stained glass window or a wooden statue on a side altar in church.
Yes, absolutely. Well, sort of in that same vein, there's something you touch on in the book that I was curious to hear a little more of your thoughts on. You mentioned this tradition that Joseph was an older widower at the time he was betrothed to Mary. It seems to me over the past couple years, there's been a bit of a swing in the opposite direction to see him as a younger man at that time. I'm just curious if you have any thoughts on those two approaches, if you think either is more likely than the other, and how maybe each of them can help us understand Joseph.
Yeah, I'm very much in the school of he was a young guy. He was not as young as Mary, who was, from all accounts, a teenager, but I do think he had a certain vigor and youthfulness to be able to do all the things that he did and to make these long trips into Egypt and back and forth in Jerusalem. And there was a lot of trekking around, and he was working with his hands. So he must have been younger than a lot of people might imagine him, and closer in age to Mary, I think.
Okay, that makes sense. Of course, when you mention the journey, it's like, I can't really see an elderly person doing all that trekking around he was doing.
Yeah.
Well, as we're coming to the end here, I'm hoping we can end on maybe a bit of a practical note. I'd love to know if you just have any advice for readers how to best utilize the book so that they can get the most out of it.
I think take it in little bites. A chapter a day is always a good way to go, and spend a little time meditating and praying. There's a lot of prayer resources in the book. I have a lot of prayers in an appendix, other prayers to St. Joseph for people to meditate on and think about. and really look at how your life relates to Joseph and how his life relates to you. And to see him, like I said, as this figure of flesh and blood who is very much like us and who went through many of the things that we go through. And the introduction, I talk about how he is, the patron saint of workers and the patron saint of fathers, but he's also the patron saint of people who don't know where they're going to be laying their head from one night to the next. The patron saint of people who are anxious or worried about the future. The patron of people who need to learn how to trust in God. And I think in many ways, at one time or another, all of those could apply to any of us. And I think we need to really look at Joseph as someone very close to us, to our experience, and someone who can help us through all of our experiences. My pastor, Monsignor Finaro, again, used to talk about how powerful a saint he is. And I think it's because he understands us in a very personal and very real way. And I hope through this book, people will come to understand him in a very personal way and see him for the great figure and great father and brother in many ways to us that he is.
Well, that's so beautiful. And thank you for giving us this tool to get to know him better. And thank you for taking the time to be with us and share it with even more people.
Thank you. It's been a blessing to be here. One of the moments that I touch on in the book, one of the 7 sorrows, is when Joseph sees Jesus born into poverty and the great sorrow that he felt at not being able to give this beautiful child, this wondrous, miraculous child, a better home at the beginning of his life. So I reflect a little bit on that in the book. At this moment in his journey, Joseph may have wondered if the God who had called him to this great adventure had somehow abandoned him. Was the miracle of Jesus really destined to begin in mud and manure? Something had to be wrong. But Joseph, with faith and patience, with prayer and profound trust, was able to realize that something, in fact, was exactly right. Despite impossible circumstances and improbable challenges, a glorious new life had come into the world. Despite the darkness of the night, it was ablaze with stars. Light had come. Parents never want their children to begin life the way Jesus did. Husbands never want their wives to endure what the mother of Jesus had to face. Seeing how it unfolded, Joseph couldn't help but feel inadequate and weak, frustrated and alone. But Joseph's disappointment and despair at seeing how Jesus was born could not last. He came to know the thrill of hope that came into the world on that night. His experience reminds us that at times when we may feel feeble, God does not see us that way. We are loved. God has plans. He has ideas, a vision, and more hope than we can even imagine. Look to the stars and trust. Even in circumstances that seem impossible, the story of Joseph reminds us all that it is possible when we give our lives over to faith, in faith, to the God of love. Fourth grade, Sister Matthew Christie at St. Peter's School in Olney, Maryland, she read us Charlotte's Web by E.B. White, and I was captivated. I absolutely loved it. And that was the moment when I decided I wanted to be a writer. I was so moved and excited and heartbroken by the story. I realized just how powerful words could be, and I wanted to be able to recapture that and to give that to other people. I don't do a lot of research. I do a lot of mulling and thinking and praying and contemplating in the shower early in the morning or while I'm shaving, and that's where I get some of my best ideas. So I don't overthink things too much. I'm not someone who does a whole lot of research, just enough to sort of get my engine going and to get the wheels turning. Well, one that changed my life was The Seven-Story Mountain by Thomas Merton. Remains one of my favorite writers. I tend to like biographies and autobiographies. The Story of a Soul by St. Therese, I like very, very much. Henry Nouwen's Gethsemane or Genesee Diary, I like a lot. And right now I'm reading a biography of Elizabeth of the Trinity. I've got it right here. She was chosen for me by Jen Fulweiler's online resource for your Saint of the Year, the patron saint. And I don't know anything about her, so I just started digging into her life, and I'm excited to learn more. I think it's the way it captures the imagination. You see everything come alive in your mind, and you see with the eyes of the heart in a lot of ways. And everybody may see things a little bit differently, but the ability to create something out of nothing is wondrous to me and miraculous. And I think it's something that we need to cherish. And I worry sometimes that writing is becoming a lost art and reading is becoming a lost art. But we need to recapture that and hold on to it. It's so important. I think probably the most surprising thing was how much I loved St. Joseph. He was not someone that I spent a whole lot of time thinking about. I think he's one of the overlooked treasures of the church. We have feast days associated with him and everything, but he's someone that a lot of Catholics just sort of push to the side and don't think about all that much. But he has become one of my best friends and someone I turn to a lot for guidance and consolation and hope and reassurance. And I hope more people are able to discover him the way that I did.
So I've been asked to talk about Deacon Greg's book, Befriending Joseph. Now, Deacon Greg Kandra and I have been friends for a very long time. So if you think that I'm just doing this because he's a friend, yes and no. I mean, I wouldn't consent to spend a couple of minutes just talking into a camera about how great this book is if I didn't believe it was a really great book. What Befriending Joseph has done, and Greg is really interesting when he writes in the book about what led him to realize that maybe this is a book that should be written. He's taken this silent man of the scripture who we really don't know. We've built many kind of devotions and legends all around Joseph, but we really don't know him. And he gives us the opportunity to know Joseph. And he does this in a variety of ways. Joseph appears 7 times in scripture, birth of the angel coming before the birth of Christ, and, the warnings, and then the nativity and the presentation. And we all know what the stories are. He brings up the fact that we're told that Joseph is an older man. And so he's already lived life. He already has some expectations. He kind of knows what it is he wants in the world. And now suddenly, and he's from the line of David, so there's a royal blood, a nobility about him already. But suddenly he's confronted with these unthinkable, remarkable situations. And he answers to them each time. And each time he answers to them with trust, with great trust. And I was struck at one point when he was talking about the flight into Egypt and how, just because he worked with his hands, because he was a tecton, was able to then support himself going into these communities in Egypt, wherever they settled in Egypt, and finding people for whom he could work. And so I was struck by that because it's such an old-fashioned guy thing to do. We don't talk about this anymore in terms of men who go out and earn a living and support the family and all of that. And yet here was Joseph in unthinkable situations, still keeping to the daily, which was to get up and to go pray, and then to get out and go work and go find the work and take care of, the people for whom he was responsible, people who have been put into his keeping. And he does this with kind of a silent surrender. And there's so much wisdom in the surrender that it's kind of breathtaking when Deacon Greg goes into his imagination and kind of just leads us through this very, you can actually kind of get a sense of the dust on the road and the bushes as Joseph walks by, as he's pacing and praying, and, maybe taking the little Jesus with him while they're in Egypt, to go off for prayer and to talk to him and to teach him things as he would his whole life. We forget that Joseph was the guy who taught Jesus to be the carpenter. And if you think about that, and you think about what lessons did Jesus learn from Joseph that went beyond the wood, that went into, you look at the irregularities and the imperfections of the wood, and as you plane it down, those become more obvious. But then you can also see the greatness of the beauty amid all of the flaws, and you can also see the minuteness of the flaws among all of the beauty. And how much might that have helped Jesus when he began his ministry to understand what he was looking at, to inform what he was looking at? Now, Jesus was God, of course, but he was also fully human. And so, he still had to learn how to read people in his way. And Joseph had to have been a part of that. Joseph, in teaching him how to be a carpenter, was also teaching him how to see people, how to form people. There's just something really beautiful in all of that. And thinking to myself, well, Joseph had the way about him, which was to listen. And I'm a Benedictine oblate, so the word listen is very powerful for me. It's the very first word in the rule of St. Benedict. In his society, which was, obviously very patriarchal society, expecting, the crown of purity from their women and all of that. And yet he listened. And because he was listening intently, he was able to say, not just to be led, but to actually consent to following. And always with this kind of sense of the bravery that comes from trust, which is sometimes you're really, really scared, but you trust anyway. And that's real bravery, when you're terrified, but you do it anyway. So I really came away from this book feeling like the way God works in our world, using the most confounding people sometimes, using people that we don't understand why. Why did God use this person to do that? Why did God put this person in charge of this? Why did God put me in charge of anything? Over and over again in Scripture, we see God using the most confounding people. And in Joseph, he used this person of silence, this strong, steady. It's almost like God is using Joseph to say, just keep the faith, just keep going, just maintain and trust in me, and I'm going to take you along, and you'll be all right. And it's going to be all right. We don't always remember that, but it usually ends up being true. It got me to this point. I mean, I liked Greg's book so much that I went and I bought another book of St. Joseph devotions so that I could speak more intimately to Joseph in different ways, and also learn to call on Joseph in different circumstances. And so now, Joseph is my friend. He's my very good friend. And that's in large part thanks to Deacon Greg and his remarkable book.
Well, thank you again to Deacon Greg for joining us, and thank you all for tuning in for Booked on Shalom World TV. We'll be back next week with another episode. Until then, happy reading.
Are you searching for purpose of life? Discover your true identity. Stay tuned to Shalom World.